Pulchritudine Praesente, Intentionality, and the Objective Perception of Beauty. It is often said that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. Ask many people and one will be surprised to find that this is the widely accepted premise. But is it really the case? Beauty, especially in our modern world, is often lampooned as mere feeling or a judgment of taste, and therefore not worth arguing about. To say that the Pietà or the rose window in the Notre Dame Cathedral, for example, are beautiful is no more different than stating my like or dislike for ice cream or coffee. In this lecture, I would like to examine our perception of beauty. Is it a mere subjective feeling, or perhaps a subjective idea of things in themselves out there in a reality we can never really know? Because these questions of aesthetics are intrinsically tied to and shaped by epistemological assumptions, we will first approach the issue of aesthetic perception by way of epistemology. The latter being an investigation of the nature of how and what man knows, or in a broader sense, what consciousness is, will help us understand what contemporary philosophers commonly refer to as intentionality, and what it has to do with man's experience of beauty. I argue that intentionality is a way, if not the best way, of seeing beauty as an objective aspect of reality, and not a mere figment of our private sentiments or imagination. Likewise, it is interesting that a deeper understanding of man's perception of beauty illumines our understanding of man's consciousness as intentional. Various thinkers have wrestled with and offered answers for this epistemological and aesthetic conundrum. The most popular opinion that I alluded to in the beginning, namely the notion of beauty as a product of subjective feeling or an utterly relative judgment of taste, is founded on an impoverished sense of reality and of man's consciousness of it. The modern philosopher René Descartes thought primarily of consciousness as a self-consciousness. The self is seen as ontologically prior to the objects of consciousness outside this completely private and autonomous self. Another famous modern epistemological approach, which builds on the Cartesian subjective assumptions, is the one that came from the British empiricists, namely John Locke and David Hume. The former described human ideas as nothing but reactions occurring in the brain as a result of external stimuli. It is not surprising that the latter, David Hume, described beauty in a way that most people today would agree with. That it is, quote, no quality in things themselves. It exists only in the mind that contemplates them, end quote. Now this might sound convincing, but we shall see that a fatal flaw lies in the very subjectivist point of departure, namely the hidden premise that views consciousness as a sort of container in which reality is present and out of which one needs to escape. The rebuttal to this is rather simple. The purported problem of getting outside of consciousness is a chimera, because to be conscious is already to be outside oneself. And why is this? Precisely because all consciousness is consciousness of, and that such a conscious act always intends or tends out to its other. That's why we use the term intentionality for this reason. Paradoxically, consciousness can only be itself in the very act of turning to another. This intentionality involves an openness to being or reality, and does not fall into the solipsistic trap in which subjectivists inevitably find themselves. This notion of intentionality is nothing new and finds a precursor in the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. The modern subjectivist presupposition of a self-enclosed consciousness that hopelessly seeks contact with reality would have been incomprehensible for St. Thomas, who views self-knowledge as inseparable from knowledge of an other. He states, for example, that, quote, "The human intellect is not its own act of understanding, nor is its own essence the first object of its understanding. For this object is the nature of a material thing, and therefore that which is first known by the human intellect is an object of this kind, and that which is known secondarily is the act by which that object is known, and through the act the intellect itself is known." End quote. In addition, St. Thomas dedicated the entirety of question 12 of the Prima Secundae of his Summa Theologiae on the topic of intentio, or intention in English. While it would be anachronistic to describe the technical sense in which the term intentionality has acquired in modern continental philosophy, their shared etymology reveals a very close signification. Aquinas simply describes intention as to tend to something. Aquinas affirms that intention is primarily an act of the will. However, he clarifies that it is not an act of the will simply, for intention presupposes knowledge, which proposes to the will the end to which the latter moves. This is highlighted even more in the perception of beauty as a transcendental, because as such it is related simultaneously to both intellect and will. That which gives delight to our wills precisely as intuitively contemplated by our cognitive faculties. Here, we can already see the perception of beauty involves, in a more proper sense, the whole person, unlike truth that is primarily acquired through the intellect, or goodness, which is primarily an affectation of the will. The one intending, or tending towards the beautiful being, presupposes a mind open to being. It would be helpful for us to look at the scholastic axiom, id quod visum placet, or that which when perceived delights. Here, St. Thomas uses the word visum, usually translated as perceived or seen, as a term not limited to visual sensation, but rather to intuitive knowledge. Of course, as embodied persons, the senses can never be fully isolated from the intellect, as nothing is known to the mind that is not first perceived through the senses. Again, far from the senses and the intellect being fully passive, the whole totality of human consciousness of reality, particularly of beauty, is an activity towards an other, and not just an idea in my own mind or imagination. Clearly, for St. Thomas, there is an other that delights, and not just some phantasm or private feeling. In my delight as subject, I move towards or intend to that other whose integritas, or unity, consonantia, harmony, and claritas, splendor or radiance, delight me as I contemplate it. Thinkers coming from the contemporary school of thought called phenomenology continue to develop this theme of the intentio, with an emphasis on the experience of the subject in its encounter with an other. The Catholic philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand, using slightly different terminology, argued that we can describe consciousness as either frontal or lateral. By frontal, he pertains to that which is given to me only in a consciousness of, and does not belong to my own person. It discloses itself to my mind and is perceived on the side of the object. Lateral consciousness, on the other hand, pertains to something consciously enacted. That's the key, consciously enacted, something which does not stand over against me frontally. In the same way that the act of seeing, for example, is not given to me in the same manner as the object I am seeing, feelings like joy, enthusiasm, or sadness are given to me laterally as they unfold in my consciousness. Also, he adds that a subject perceives beauty not just as a mere neutral object of consciousness, but precisely as a value. A value is something that is important in itself and demands a response from the recipient. As such, it is an objective aspect of reality that requires a subject that is ready or have the capacity to receive this gift, this irradiation of beauty from the other. The perception of beauty is perhaps the best instance of intentionality that we can have in our human experience for several reasons. For one, in an authentic encounter of beauty, the object is not merely perceived as dumbly there. Rather, it is a consciousness of the other that is so complete and intense, because the subject is drawn not just intellectually or sensibly. The whole person, with all its intellectual and volitional faculties and appetites, in a way, is invited to respond. The subject is moved, is called out of himself, literally an ecstasis, in his very consciousness of this irradiation of the splendor of being in the beautiful other. Consider how much this would be amplified if the bearer of beauty that is encountered is not merely an inanimate thing, but another mind with its own consciousness. In this case, we no longer have a mere other, but a thou. This is a point that can be a topic in and of itself of another lecture, so we won't dive deep into it. So let's move on to the next point, which is to discuss the theme of appearance, which distinguishes beauty from other transcendentals such as truth or goodness. The term appearance here does not merely pertain to the visible or superficial sphere. It points to the primordial dimension of being, or that which shines out as a splendor, an irradiation from being. This dimension of the outward appearance can be described as that which addresses itself in a special way to the person. It has the character of a self-revelation, a speaking to the person. In other words, man's encounter with beauty does not necessitate a subject to aggressively grasp and manipulate beauty in his own terms. Rather, it involves the openness of a subject, Pulchritudine Praesente, as my title suggests, which means in the presence of the beautiful, or with beauty being present face to face with the subject. Here lies an example of how beauty can reconcile two seemingly contradictory activities in the human experience, and why the consciousness of beauty goes beyond the simple act of intentionality. This is because the activity of tending towards the beautiful also includes, at the same time, a stance of receptivity on the part of the subject. Our experience of beauty has a certain capaciousness to it that can somehow bring together aspects of reality that are normally viewed as distinct, or worse, even irreconcilably separate. In one's experience of the beautiful, a certain convergence occurs between truth and goodness, intellect and will, immanence and transcendence, mind and body. Remember in the beginning we talked about the whole person encountering beauty, spirit and matter, or theologically in Christ, as Hans Urs von Balthasar, for example, suggested. Even the hypostatic union of human and divine in one person is a locus of beauty manifested as glory. Intentionality, despite its technical connotations, I think, touches on a primordial ache that is found deep down in every being. It is my hope that in juxtaposing it with the transcendental beauty, we have at least opened a path towards seeing the relationality, the movement towards communion that intentionality reveals to us. Also, I do not think it an exaggeration to claim that beauty is a great antidote if not the only antidote against the humdrum dullness of a purely subjective understanding of human consciousness, nay, of human existence, that the modern world tries to offer. Beauty, in its unique and comprehensive way, grounds consciousness out of the subjectivist trap and draws it out towards the splendor of being. It is a very important bridge that heals the chasm between being and consciousness that has bedeviled much of modern philosophies. Practical solipsism has turned much of our world into a wasteland of scattered subjects, interiorities trapped in their own bubble. Only in the openness to reality, openness to being, that man can at least begin his first steps towards that for which he is intended for, which is not only to exist in reference to another, but to find himself by becoming a total gift of self to the other.